Australia supplies quality beef of all descriptions to over 60 different markets throughout the world. The major export markets are the United States of America, Japan, Korea, Canada, and Taiwan. These markets provide many opportunities for beef producers to target a selected market using a range of production systems. Approximately half the Australian beef produced is used domestically and half is exported. Whatever the target market, it's important that the product meets the required market specifications to ensure customer satisfaction and optimum returns. Beef producers can achieve this by selecting cattle which meet these market specifications. Age, sex, weight, and fatness are the most important criteria for selection, followed by degree of muscularity. Age and sex are readily identifiable. However, differentiating between the components of live weight, that is, fat, muscle, and bone, in live animals requires skill and practice. Because the commercial value of a carcass is determined by the amount of saleable meat it yields, the proportions of fat, muscle, and bone in an animal is critical. Of these three components, the proportion of bone in a carcass varies the least, usually within a range of 13 to 15% of the carcass weight. By contrast, the fat content of a carcass can vary quite considerably. The ideal amount of fat on the carcass varies from market to market depending on consumer preferences and can range from 10 to 30%. For the meat processor or retailer, the proportion of fat and muscle in a carcass is critical. A carcass which has the ideal amount of fat for a particular market requires very little trimming. Such a carcass will clearly have a higher yield of saleable meat compared with one which needs to be trimmed of surplus fat to meet the market specification. In fact, it's the customer's preference for fatness which is used to define individual market specifications. For example, let's compare two beef markets which require vastly different levels of fatness: the Japanese high-quality market and the Korean frozen bone-in market. The Japanese market specifies grain-fed beef with up to 23 millimetres of fat at the P8 site. In this specification, fat can comprise up to 36% of the carcass weight. By contrast, the Korean bone-in market requires fat to be trimmed to no more than 10 millimetres. At this fat level, fat constitutes approximately 18% of the carcass weight. Beef carcasses which meet the fat specifications of the Japanese high-quality market will show obvious differences when compared with those meeting the specifications of the Korean market. With differences as large as these, even as live cattle, those differences are obvious. Often, however, the differences are more subtle. This is so when selecting the most suitable cattle for a particular market specification. In this situation, on the farm or in the feedlot, skills in live animal assessment are critical. The same skill can be used whether selecting slaughter or feeder steers. Over-the-hooks trading on a weight and grade or price grid basis has enabled the payment of premiums or discounts according to the quality of carcasses produced. Under these circumstances, selection of the correct cattle for slaughter becomes vital. Any cattle not meeting the required market specifications can be severely discounted. In the next few minutes, the techniques used in assessing live cattle for fat content and degree of muscularity will be demonstrated. Equipped with these basic skills, producers can make the most of market opportunities. With practice, the size, shape, and placement of the carcass components in the live animal can be accurately predicted. Let's compare two steers, which at first glance appear to have similar carcass characteristics. To assist in making these comparisons, the skeleton can be used as the standard reference guide, since, as you'll recall, it is a relatively constant component in the carcass. Note that the skeletal size of these two steers is very similar. This is indicated by the similarity in the height at the pin bones hips, and the shoulders. But on closer inspection, there are some real differences in body composition. Despite similar skeletal size, the dark grey steer on the left weighs 32 kilograms more than the light grey coloured steer on the right. Let's examine the two live steers in detail to assess what differences there are under the hide. The fat content of cattle can be assessed by inspecting those parts of the animals where only fat is deposited between the hide and the bone. These are the brisket, underline, flank, twist, cod, and tailhead areas. Firstly, let's look at the brisket area. This is an area where there's virtually no muscle development, so any enlargement in this area is due to fat deposits. From this angle, the steer on the left is deep and full in the brisket, indicating a heavy fat deposit. By comparison, the steer on the right has less development in the brisket, indicating less fat. The underline also indicates the degree of fatness, as there is similarly no muscle development in this area. When viewed from the side, the dark grey steer has a lower underline, indicating more fat deposit than the light grey coloured steer, which has a trimmer underline. Taking a closer look, note the fullness in the flank of the dark steer on the left. Again, this fullness is due to fat buildup. Compare it with the lack of fill in the flank of the light coloured steer on the right. When viewing these steers from the rear, the build-up of fat deposits in the steer on the left are indicated by fullness of the cod and the twist. In contrast, the steer on the right tends to cut up in the twist, with only slight development in the cod, indicating less fat. While viewing the steers from behind, it can also be seen that the steer on the left shows the stomach protruding on both sides. This is due to a buildup of fat around the internal organs. On the lighter coloured steer, however, the stomach can't be seen from the rear view, indicating less internal fat. Another indicator of fat deposits from the rear of the animal is the presence of filling around the tailhead area. The steer on the left shows a distinct fat buildup in this area, while the steer on the right shows no evidence of these deposits. Remember that fat is not always evenly distributed over the animal, so all indicator sites should be observed. Cattle with an even distribution of fat will carry it in each of the indicator sites and be smooth in appearance. Because these areas, the brisket, underline, flank, cod, twist, and tailhead, contain little or no muscle development, a trained eye can soon determine that this dark-coloured steer carries more fat than the light-coloured steer. Having now established the degree of fatness in each steer, the next stage is to determine the degree of muscularity. As in the technique for assessing fatness, muscularity is assessed by examining only those sites on the body where little fat is deposited and muscle predominates between the hide and the bone. These are the stifle, the hindquarter, and the back line. In addition, width of stance, both front and rear, is a good indicator of muscularity. Note the difference in the stance of these animals. Firstly, from the rear. The narrow stance of the dark grey steer on the left is a result of this animal having a flatter muscle pattern compared with the light grey steer on the right. And from the front, again the steer on the left stands narrower. The steer on the right has a rounder muscle pattern, causing it to stand wide. The lack of roundness or fullness in the hindquarter of the dark grey steer on the left reflects a lack of muscularity, while the light grey steer on the right shows evidence of greater muscle development. Care should be taken not to confuse muscle with fat when viewing from this angle. Excessively fat cattle will look square, while well-muscled cattle will have a rounded appearance when viewed from this angle. Note further that the steer on the right has a greater outer curvature in this region than the steer on the left. Also that the widest point through the hind quarter of the steer on the right is lower on the body, indicating a greater degree of muscularity when compared with the steer on the left. When viewed along the back line, well-muscled cattle will tend to be wide across the back from the loin to the shoulders. Note also that the light grey steer has a more prominent stifle muscle, again indicating a greater degree of muscularity than the dark steer. By contrast, the steer on the left has a flatter, less developed muscle pattern, resulting in reduced muscle definition. When these steers are slaughtered, closer examination of what's under the hide will be possible to fine-tune the assessment technique. After slaughter, the animals were stood up on the slaughter floor to evaluate them in a similar stance to that for the live assessment. Firstly, let's remove the hide and examine the brisket area. Note how the steers have retained the shape of the brisket, the same as it was in the live animals. But look what happens when the fat's removed. Now, both briskets have taken on a similar appearance. This confirms that a change in brisket shape is mainly due to fat. The carcass, which appeared fatter in the live assessment, has yielded 4.7 kilograms of fat from the throat and brisket area. The leaner steer yielded only 2.5 kilograms of fat from the corresponding area, confirming our assessment of fatness in the brisket of each steer. Without the hide, heavy fat deposits are obvious in the cod and twist of the steer on the left, as was predicted. The fat trimmed from this area on the fatter steer weighed 7 kilograms. The leaner steer yielded only 4.5 kilograms of fat from the cod and twist area. Compare the tail head area of both steers before being trimmed of fat. Note there is more filling around the tail head of the steer on the left when compared to the steer on the right. Now look at the tail head after the fat has been removed. The steer on the left has lost all the filling. There is little difference made to the steer on the right. Now compare the flanks of both steers before the fat's removed. With only the hide removed, the flanks of these steers have retained their original shape. After the fat has been removed, the results confirm the degree of fatness as assessed in the live animals. The fatter steer by the assessment was in fact the fatter carcass and yielded a total of 39 kilograms of subcutaneous fat and 22 kilograms of internal fat. By comparison, the leaner steer yielded 20 kilograms of subcutaneous fat and 11 kilograms of internal fat. Now, with all the fat removed, the degree of muscularity in each carcass can be more easily evaluated. These differences are most obvious when viewing the carcasses from the front, showing the wider stance due to the greater degree of muscularity for the steer on the right, compared to narrow stance of the lighter muscled steer on the left. And from the rear, again showing the wider stance for the more muscular steer on the right compared to the steer on the left. Remember, in the live assessment, the light grey steer had a wider stance than the dark grey steer. It is wider through the hindquarters where it is most desirable, in the stifle region, and shows greater curvature in the outer area compared to the dark-coloured steer. Here in the hindquarter, it shows also the carcass from the light grey steer is rounder from the tail to the leg compared to the carcass of the dark grey steer. Muscularity can also be exhibited along the back line. The more muscular animals that are wide across the loin tend to carry width through from the loin to the shoulders. To further determine the differences in carcass composition, the carcasses were boned out. The rump, loin and round were removed from each carcass and trimmed to produce acceptable retail cuts. It is clear there are significant differences in both the amount of saleable meat and the amount of fat trimmed from each carcass. Remember the fatter, dark grey steer with the flatter muscle pattern? It yielded 18 kilograms of saleable meat from the loin, rump and round. This represents a saleable meat yield of 62% from these three cuts. By comparison, the leaner, light grey steer with the rounder muscle pattern yielded 21 kilograms of saleable meat from comparative cuts, representing a saleable meat yield of 71%. A closer look at the carcass details reveals the facts. The darker steer had 25 millimetres of fat at the P8 site, compared with 10 millimetres for the light grey steer on the right. The fatter, dark grey steer had a dressing percentage of 56%. The leaner steer, 60%. When comparing the yield of saleable meat, the fatter, dark grey steer yielded 57%, while the leaner, light grey steer yielded 71%. This adds up to a total of 46 kilograms more saleable meat being cut from the light grey steer compared to the dark grey steer. To compare the ribeye areas of these steers, the weight and fat composition difference must be accounted for. By converting the carcass weights to a fat-free basis, a direct comparison between the ribeye areas of the two carcasses can be made. Having carried out this conversion, the fatter, lighter muscle dark grey steer on the left had a ribeye area ratio of 26 square centimetres per 100 kilograms of fat-free carcass weight, while the leaner, more muscular light grey steer on the right had a ribeye area ratio of 31 square centimetres per 100 kilograms of fat-free carcass weight. These charts show the percentage of muscle, fat and bone in each carcass. The leaner, more muscular steer yielded 14% more saleable meat than the fatter, less muscular steer. Simple live animal assessment techniques can be done accurately to identify the real differences in the carcass composition of individual live animals. Remember, when assessing live cattle for fatness, look for deposits of fat in the brisket, underline, flank, twist, cod, and around the tailhead. When assessing for muscularity, examine width of stance, roundness of the hindquarter, thickness through the rear, particularly the stifle region, and the degree of curvature in this outer region. Also, examine the muscular development in the loin through to the shoulders. Live animal assessment can provide an accurate picture of the suitability of cattle to meet the specifications of particular markets. Accuracy will improve with practice, and there's great satisfaction in getting it right. The aim is to know your product, then deliver what the market demands to optimize your returns.